Okay, so once again, welcome to the webinar series. My name is Pat Riley. I'm the webinar coordinator for AMATIC. This is co-sponsored by MAA, and I'll let Keith Hubbard introduce himself in just a moment. Our webinar presenter today is Dr. Uri Treisman, Math Placement Trends and Innovations that Increase Equitable Access and Success. The views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATIC or MAA. Commercial products mentioned by the presenters are not endorsed by the AMATIC or the MAA. We want to thank McGraw-Hill and Alex for sponsoring the webinar series. And Jeremy, I will end my part if anyone else wants to introduce themselves, and we can switch over to the presenter slides.
Yahoo! Well, I think I speak for all of us when I say I'm real excited to hear your comments, Uri, and also what folks from across the country are interested in. My name is Keith Hubbard. I'm the chair of the MAA's Committee on Articulation and Placement. Our counterparts at AMATIC seem equally interested and excited to hear. You've probably already heard Uri Treisman's name many times, but just 2 sentences of background. Uri is the founder and director of the Charles A. Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin. He was the Harvard Foundation's 2006 Scientist of the Year and a leading architect of the Pathways model in mathematics placement. The last time I heard him speak, he was talking about having visited literally hundreds of different classrooms, looking at what worked and what didn't. So with that, Uri, I'd love to hear your opening remarks.
Well, welcome everyone to this webinar. It's good to see so many friends and colleagues who've signed up to this. And especially wonderful is that many of the people on this list have been leading placement efforts on their campuses. So there's a lot of expertise. And these webinars, one of the key purposes is to surface the wisdom of the field. It's so hard in our discipline. When we work in our lives as mathematicians, we have mechanisms for learning from each other. It's relatively easy to learn from each other. But when it comes to department practices and educational practices, it's really hard to learn from each other. So these webinars, where we can bring together the people working on the practical issues of improvement and sort of surface the issues together, are especially important. So placement. By any standard, placement is in the policy spotlight. At every campus I visit, there are a few people who really have worked hard on it, have tried to get better measures from better uses of placement instruments, and work hard to make sure students are in the right courses at the right time. But now, there are fundamental changes in the ecosystem of higher education that are driving big changes in placement policy. So the goal here in my initial remarks is to put some perspective on what are the drivers of these current efforts to modernize placement, to share some essential references and lessons learned, and to identify practices that are worthy of attention by math departments, make it easier for the community to find practices that they can build off, even if not perfect, things we can start from. So what are the big drivers? The first one is the completion agenda. In 2008, with the recession, financial exigencies matched with big enrollment declines, demographic trends, meant that institutions, for their very survival, needed to be more effective at helping students complete complete programs of study, to graduate with degrees. And in that effort, people began to look much harder at us, at mathematics, because the highest failure rate courses in higher ed are in mathematics. And as they began to look more closely, they started taking apart the different processes we use to teach students and to place students. So, or we had an explosion. I guess you could say what used to be nice, student success, is now necessary for administrators and systems. So people in the policy world began to study placement and success in freshman courses. And the first big study that really disequilibrated standard placement practices was not about the reliability or validity of placement instruments. It was how placement was actually executed. And it's a beautiful piece of work that will be on our reference list called One Shot Deal. Andrea Venezia, who had been one of my students actually at UT Austin, went out and watched orientation placement exam giving. And she observed that in many institutions, students showed up for orientation and at 5 o'clock would take a placement test. And in fact, we're not told in advance the consequences of this placement test. In fact, the normative practice was to tell students it didn't matter. And in fact, at that time, the College Board website even had a recommendation that students not study for placement tests because it might give them a false reading. So what she found was that students did not prepare, and that meant that these instruments had a very hard time distinguishing between people who had never had content and people who were just rusty. So this was the first big, study that influenced policymakers and led in some states to legislation and in other states to some system guidance about notifying students about the importance of placement, making sure that students had access to preparatory materials. And this is quite a trend. Even at my institution, it used to be that students showed up, paid $70, took a placement test. They could take it again if they had $70. Now we've seen the damage that caused. And now students, when they're admitted, get a letter telling them they will take a placement test, get materials, prep materials for it, and can study for it over the summer and retake it for free. And it's had a big effect, right, on reducing the number of students who were in the wrong course at the wrong time. So it's a beautiful piece of work. But then we started seeing more serious studies, particularly those done by Judith Scott Clayton at the Community College Resource Center in New York, studies connected to the MDRC group, high quality work, studies by John Hett in California. And we'll give you references to these studies. And the studies showed two things that frankly surprised me, right? The first was that high school grades were much better predictors than faculty thought they were of student success. And largely that's because high school grades are in part a measure, and GPAs and class rank are measures of sustained effort. And I frankly couldn't believe the results, but then you see 10 different studies with really tight methodology. And it called into question our prejudice that there was too much variation by school quality. And along with that were studies, Judith Scott Clayton's was the first, that showed that Accuplacer, Compass, instruments of that type were far less effective at placing students than we had thought, and that their creators had told us they were. That the validity studies for these instruments were not what should have been there. So we also saw, so because this research came out and it was replicated research at high levels, it forced systems that were dealing with enrollment crises, need to completion, to rethink placement. So on one hand, we have faculty working with their own data, but now we have system data that calls into question some of the premises of the work. And it's important that those of you responsible for your department's placement at least browse this literature and check whether it applies to your situation. I think you'll be surprised by what they found. Then what happened was states got in the game. The evidence was so strong that in California, AB 705, Florida, SB 1720, Texas, HB 2223, that states began determining what the rules were with regard to placement. And the general trend has been to dramatically reduce the use of placement for remedial courses and to increase the use of high school measures, which has policy reasons to support it. So it used to be that you really could look just to MAA or AMATIC for guidance. But department leaders now need to keep abreast of what the changing legislative rules are that affect placement. So lots of stuff going on in the ecosystem and lots of beautiful research that we can learn from as a field. And now finally, two big events in the math world that further raise questions about traditional placement. The first is the multiple pathways movement. When most of these instruments were validated, it was typically anchored in Algebra 2 or pre-calculus, the tests. But we know dramatic increases in statistics course taking, in quantitative reasoning course taking. So now the task is not just to place a student into one course, but helping students make decisions based on their purposes about which course sequence they should take. So that further complicated placement. And then if that weren't enough, co-requisite movement. In many departments, our measures were based on students just going into courses with no support. But in growing numbers of states, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Florida, California, courses now come with supports. So cutoff scores, simple cutoff scores that were created 5 years ago that could fairly well predict which students might succeed in a course need to be rethought. And now one more little element, and that is replicated research that shows that in too many cases when students take a placement test and learn that they need to take remediation, the discouragement causes them to drop out. So many of the classical validity studies used to set cutoff scores did not take into account that a whole cohort of students, disproportionately poor, disproportionately of color, responded to the message by not taking the course. So their data wasn't included in the cutoff scores. So we have a mess, guys and gals. We have instruments that used to be used to solve a really important question. How do we help students get in the right course at the right time? And the validity of those tools has now been called into question. And we need to go back to ground zero to figure out in our new context with multiple math pathways, with co-requisite support, with states trying to reduce the gap between high school education and college. How do we solve the problem of helping students make informed choices about what course they should take? And how do we help departments set guidelines that increase the probability that students end up in the right place? So I hope that gave you a sense of the environment that we're in. Now the question is, what do we do with that information? we've already collected a large list of questions, and I hope that one of the things we can collectively do is try to generate a superb list of questions for us all collectively, because we don't have the answers to all of this yet. This is a field, we're in a period of change. So I looked at the first questions that came across and sort of grouped them by types. So while you, dear audience, generate your questions, and maybe also pointers to things that have been especially important to your department in working on this problem, so we can share and collect that wisdom. I'll make some comments about the questions that have come up, and then I invite discussion on these questions, and then we'll start climbing through the additional questions. Now, just a last thing. So I spent a lot of time on campuses. And what I found is that people who put a lot of time into something, responsible members of math departments, tend to fall in love with the things that they've done. And that some commercial products, people either hate them or love them. There's passionate commitment to some and passionate opposition. I find that so interesting to see the levels of attachment to these tools. But I think enough questions have been raised about them so that we really do all need to step back, look at the policy context, look at the research, and, I think healthy skepticism about these instruments. A skepticism that's worthy of us as scholars, right? It's time to exercise that skepticism. Lots of, student success really depends on proper placement. So the 4 questions, when we looked at like 50 questions that came up, there were really 4 themes. The first was, can we really trust high school GPA? Because we know that an A in one school means something completely different than an A in another. But what the research shows, large data sets, is that having taken a course in high school, together with high school GPA, is a much better predictor of success than any existing placement instrument. And you can see, if you want to follow this, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine had a workshop on remediation reform in mid-March of this year, developmental education workshop. And the Academy vetted, put together a group of experts with no dog in the race. And the papers from that conference are a great starting point for math department members, for faculty who are charged with setting their placement criteria. Really nice work.
Uri, if I could interject, I've seen a number of questions that say something like, let's say we believe in the validity of high school GPA, but the measurement systems are so different. What do we functionally do about 4.5 and 5.0 and different schools counting different things? How do we even compare? Could you say a word to that also here?
Yeah. So again, what we're seeing around the country is new systems coming into place. The John Het work from California really addresses that quite nicely, as does materials from MDRC. Now, I think one element of this is ad hoc math department instruments are going to have a hard time working with those questions. The placement, because placement is more policy salient now and more consequential than we thought, I think we're going to see institution-wide instruments, right? Ones that require more resources to develop, in fact, are going to replace a lot of ad hoc instruments. The vendors may not be happy with that, or they may be happy. It's going to probably change market share. But one of the reasons I suspect we're going to see state-level instruments or system-level instruments is that placement decisions at college A tend to affect students at colleges B, C, D, and E in the same environment. And given the pressure to increase the success of students in states in higher ed, degree completion, there's going to be a lot of pressure to have some kind of synchronicity in the instruments used in institutions that effectively share the same students. So I think dealing with the question of that this school gives extra points for AP credit in their GPA, that this is going to require institutional solutions, not ad hoc math department solutions. We don't really have the capacity in most of our math departments to build the kind of instruments that are going to meet the standards of practice that are going to be required by state policy.
I'm also seeing a number of questions about how long does the research say that high school GPA is accurate?
Yeah, so the best study I've seen of this was done by Toby Parks in Florida. And also good work in North Carolina, system work in North Carolina and Virginia. What initially the guess was 2 or 3 years. And high school GPA turned out to actually have a longer shelf life than seemed plausible. I'm not sure people understand why that is, but the general answer they give off the cuff is, again, that high school GPA is a measure of general effort over time. This idea that high school GPA is something you produce over years. So it's not just a measure of your math facility, conceptual and procedural understanding of mathematics. It's something about your willingness to stick with a system, right? Persist in your work. So I think the Florida study actually showed that it was pretty good predictive measure for 5 or 6 years, which I found, frankly, surprising. I do think that we're seeing policy nuance. We have students, for example, coming out of the military, and we have returning students in their 30s and 40s. Not this year, but when the next recession hits, we'll see an increase in older students coming back. And I think in Florida, we're going to probably see, for students who have a certain level of maturity and experience, experimentation with self-placement. Whereas it's generally regarded that self-placement for directionless 18-year-olds would be a nightmare and irresponsible. So we might see some segmentation. And I think that's already happening in Florida. So that, so read the literature on high school GPA. Read it, I read it with a pretty skeptical eye, because I know how much variation there is in high school grades. But it certainly caused me to question my own skepticism, particularly the California and Florida studies.
Uri, there is a question on the chat talking about GPA. Are we talking about the overall GPA or just the math GPA?
Overall GPA. In some of the new models, the measure that's used is overall GPA plus a grade in a previously taken math course. So like this models for predicting statistics success in California community colleges, it's an aggregate GPA, which tells you something about sustained effort, ability to persist in a system, together with having gotten C's or B's in certain courses. So if you look at the HET reference that we'll give you, you can actually see the technical measures. Again, remember, this is a time of enormous experimentation, right, at state level data sets. The second big issue is the prevalence of co-requisites. Traditionally, placement instruments were designed to predict what would happen if a student went into a traditional course without special supports. But as we've seen in Georgia and in Tennessee and now in Texas, certainly increasingly in the CUNY system in New York, that very large proportions of students not only take courses, but they take them with structured supports. And that, what we've seen already in the data set, that has a big effect on whether students will persist and which students will actually persist successfully through these courses. So the days when there was just some tutoring if students needed it, plus some responsible math department attention to students, it's a very different environment than when you have structured supports for important freshman gateway courses. I'm teaching the co-requisite for freshman calculus at UT Austin, and it's a revelation. I have all these students who would not, and by state law, are not allowed to take a college credit course at our institution, but we got an exemption. And it turns out those students are doing just fine. Some need a little extra help, but since they have extra hours a week, they're using it. And they're marching through courses they wouldn't have had access to, which means they're on track for their physics courses and so on. So this is a period of experimentation. It's time to roll up our sleeves in our departments, figure out what's going on in our states and our institutions, spend a little time looking at the literature, assessing whether we think it has its quality research first, right, and then seeing what we can learn from it. But definitely, the co-requisite movement has changed the profile of students who were able to succeed in substantive courses with mathematical integrity. A solid freshman statistics course, quantitative literacy course, pre-calculus course.
Uri, there's some discussion in the thread about self-placement, and I know one of the discussions with co-requisite is Florida's optional placement into co-requisite courses. Are you familiar with research on self-placement into co-requisite or versus required co-requisite?
Yeah, I think the guess, when Florida legislation came in, this was Senate Bill 1720 in Florida that made optional things that had previously been required. There was a sense that we were sending students to their academic deaths. Didn't turn out that way. It turned out that students were not harmed by that in the aggregate. When I say that, that doesn't mean that subpopulations weren't harmed. You have to look at the data very carefully. But on the whole, on average, there were more beneficiaries than people who were harmed by these policies. And I think, again, looking at Toby Park's work, and there are several doctoral dissertations now in production on this topic, my assessment of them, and now, the work is not done, but this idea of population segmentation is catching on. It has a pretty good research base. Let me just say for military, students, people who come out of service in the military have a certain maturity. 30, 40-year-olds who had solid high school backgrounds, but are rusty and modestly terrified about going back to school after 20 years, they have a kind of maturity that seems to me, as a matter of respect and research plausibility, that we should experiment with self-placement tools. Certain individuals come in with maturity. They should be able to decide what they can take on. And we need to develop not a test maybe, but a kit of some type where they can make an informed decision. If you're going to do that with 18-year-olds with no direction, I would call that the height of irresponsibility. So we're seeing, where does this come from? There are several good studies of online education. And some of those studies, randomized control studies, have actually been stopped because the results have been so clear, stopped for harm. Certain folks, we can predict are going to make good use, have the maturity to organize themselves to learn from those systems. And there are other individuals that clearly do not, and they fall into certain groups, probably with a healthy group of people where it's not clear whether the answer is yes or no. But there are certainly people who would benefit from self-placement, I think. It's worth experimenting with it. And there are certain individuals for which it's likely to be irresponsible. Figuring out who's who is part of our work. I think the next cluster of questions that we had to do with the equity implications of placement. And I think it's pretty clear from the research that traditional placement instruments are not generally equity friendly, even when they were designed with the hopes that they would be. And it's especially true if you look at the students who interpret the scores and are assigned to remediation who drop out, that the equity implications there are particularly concerning. So I think in our departments as a broader issue, it's important that we know who we're serving well, that we get more sophisticated at understanding who benefits from our instruction. And I just want to make a certain note about this. Usually this discussion focuses on negatives and failures of our departments. But it's when you're working with data, it's really important for math departments to start by documenting the things they do well. If you don't have a history of working with data, it's easier to start with things that are successes. It takes a while to learn how to use system data rather than the ad hoc data you might have in your departments. Because largely system data was designed to be used for compliance, not for improvement. It takes a while to learn to use it. And it's dangerous if we sort of focus on negatives or difficult areas. This is a side point. It takes a while to get up to speed in using institutional data sets. I recommend the departments that first exercises is make good guesses of what they do well. I think we know what we do well. And start by documenting that, increasing the rigor with which you can answer questions about our own effectiveness. It's not easy. There's also the questions when you use system data of confidentiality, FERPA rules. And some of us in math departments have had to learn all kinds of legal stuff and get certified to use certain data sets to get the kind of information we really need to make good decisions. Topic for a separate webinar: how to work with institutional research offices. So shall we look at other questions coming up? Make them hard, guys.
Well, since we're on the topic of equity, there's a question about data based on gender, given that there are 3 women for every 2 men at college graduations.
Yeah. So I think it's one of the fascinating things about the research on this is it shows that high school GPA, for example, actually favors women over men in placement. Probably because women are socialized to do their homework and to persist in systems more than men, to at least a small extent. I think we have to check whenever we make critical decisions about our educational systems. We need to ask ourselves, who are the beneficiaries of these decisions that we've made? And how can we know that with some rigor? Let me give you an example. The Dana Center works on equity-minded improvement at scale. So we had many of our programs were opening access to nursing programs in 4-year colleges and 2-year colleges for students of color. And then, we asked the question, are these students really succeeding? They're succeeding in the prerequisite courses, but are they succeeding in the end in getting the degrees? And what we discovered was very painful. It turned out in urban community colleges in Texas, more than 60% of the students who got nursing degrees started with a baccalaureate degree. We weren't even aware that 7% of community college students in our state transfers have BA degrees, and the community colleges are effectively their graduate school. And we learned that the people actually getting the degrees, our students were passing courses, but they weren't actually getting the degrees because they couldn't compete with the advantaged students who had gotten 3.5s, couldn't get into medical school, worked at Starbucks as a barista for 2 years, knew they needed to get a job, went to community college, and basically got all the clinical rotation spots. So if you're serious about equity, which we are almost overwhelmingly in our profession, we need to ask questions. How do we know who the beneficiaries are of our policies? And placement is the first critical policy that shapes student trajectories. So we need to be able to answer these questions, not just because we have particular equity commitments, but these are central questions of the beneficiaries of what we do. It seems that is core to our professionalism, to be able to say, who did we actually benefit, as opposed to who did we think we might benefit, or who could benefit from our decision.
So I believe I hear you saying that it's maybe less important whether some theoretical national program has gender equity, and it's more important that you look at what the practical effects at your institution are.
I wouldn't go that far, Keith. Okay. I think it's important for all efforts to be fair. God, in our country, we need to make sure that effort pays off.
Okay.
The diligence and effort pays off, and that there's fairness in our systems. Mm-hmm. Right? But we also have to make sure that we understand how our particular institutions produce results. Things that work on average don't necessarily work at every institution.
Can I add to that question? I have an interesting question about how this placement and emphasis on high school GPA affects homeschool students and international students.
Mm. Yeah, that's the kind of issue which I am the wrong guy. Yeah, if you're in charge of this is why you have to work with your institutional, your IR office, and your enrollment management folks. Right? These are complicated issues. We're in systems with enormous diversity, and we don't want our systems to exclude populations of students from certain kinds of schools, whether they be private religious schools, home schools. And they're also our kids, man. We got to make sure that our systems are fair.
Yeah. Uri's admonition that he might not have personal expertise here is a great chance to plug the add-on to this webinar, which is that Uri and his team at the Dana Center has recognized that if you're going to have dozens and dozens of people in a webinar, there are probably going to be questions that we can't do justice to in this hour. And also there are tons of references that Uri has made that it would be nice to just have a link to, hyperlinks to. So the plan is that we're going to collect these questions. The Dana Center personnel and Uri are going to work as much as they can. I mean, there are many unanswered questions to address them seriously. And sometime in the future, I've been told it's not going to be a few-day process, to post answers to that on the blog through the Dana Center. I believe that's going to be a guest blog through MAA. And Pat, is that going to be a blog format or a website format with Amatic?
They're setting up a blog format.
Hey. So just, you might have heard some of these resources. I've jotted down some names that you've cited, Uri, and I'm looking forward to that. But just know that if your question doesn't get addressed, or if you heard of a resource and you said, I'd really like that to look more deeply into that, be expecting that to come out.
Yeah, so we have put together a starter list, which you now see, of key resources. And we worked pretty hard to make sure, we've looked pretty carefully at these, and the methodology is pretty solid. So these are good starter articles. And by the way, if you're studying this on your own system, you should start from some of the ideas that they put together here. There are now pretty large national data sets that one can use to validate these studies. So it's worth looking at. There is a question that's come up I would like to address. And that is, for students, for those of us who are interested in producing more STEM graduates, especially more math majors, frankly, in my case, or people who go into mathematically intensive majors, there is concern because institutions are also pushing for timely completion. Right? And they're trying to get everyone out in 4 years. So what do we do? How do we create the extra space for these students? And how do we place these students so they really can complete programs? Well, there are some surprises in this. And again, some of this is a genuine surprise. I teach calculus every fall. I know that students need a lot of background. You can't do my calculus course, which has proofs in it. We prove a lot of, we take the key theorems and we use them to prove other important results. They need experience. They need computational facility. But what we are seeing in a lot of institutions, and this is a pleasant surprise, is that students who started in statistics, who get A's, actually are able to go back into the pre-calc track. It seems that for some students, having a high level of success in any mathematics course somehow gives them the whatever it takes to do the very hard work of compensating for years of non-involvement in math courses where they actually manipulated symbols and developed intuition about symbols. And the CUNY randomized controlled studies found this also, that we may be not correctly understanding exactly how prerequisites work and what they are. It sort of jarred my own understanding. So I'm in a state of somewhat healthy confusion right now. And I am working with students for the first time in my class who would have never been in that class before. And I spent a lot of time paying attention to my students. And I'm really finding that it's harder than I thought it would be to guess which students are actually doing really well in advance. So I think the findings of this work suggest that we should be a little more skeptical than we have been about exactly what students need to know to succeed, and how the role of a positive experience in a mathematical science course might actually create a pathway. That's not to say at some point students aren't going to have to do a lot of work to build intuition about mathematical objects. There's no way to proceed at a certain point without real intuition that comes from experience and practice. But it may be that there are roots into our field. There are more roots into our field than we might have presumed.
We have a question about co-requisites and long-term, them risking the same discouragement effect that we saw in remedial mathematics. Perhaps it's the fad and we haven't seen the 4-time takers yet because it's not 4 years old. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so there are now places, Georgia, CUNY, some of the California campuses, some of the Texas campuses, where these structures have been in place for 4 or 5 years, and there are independent entities studying them, right, with very solid technical skill. Alexandra Loeb, right, one of the great developmental social scientists, is studying the CUNY efforts. And so far in every case, what we're discovering is that the co-requisites work, and that students, when you match them, you put together a propensity matching study. What you see is that students who have a success in an initial course tend to persist, that students can catch up. So again, this raises questions about how we used to think of prerequisites. But I caution against an overly romantic view of these things. Math is difficult. It takes a lot of experience. Computational facility and conceptual understanding take time to develop. So I don't think there are people who believe that no prerequisites matter, that anybody can take any course. I think they're crazy, and I think they're irresponsible. But that's not what's happening in co-requisites. In co-requisites, people in the co-requisite that I'm teaching, a team of my doctoral students and I sat down and tried to map out what students need to know, how many hours these students are going to have to work in addition to the regular stuff to build the skill sets to be able to do problems. And co-requisites are relatively new. We can get a lot better at it. In fact, I'm thinking of doing an MAA AMATIC blog on these co-requisite courses where you can see the daily materials. It's a little humiliating some weeks, I will say that. But I think we need to start getting better at crafting these support systems for forward motions of students who want to enter our kind of lives. But the co-requisites so far are working. The evidence is not counter. It could have worked out badly. You could help people pass a particular course in ways that do not set them up to pass the subsequent course. But that's not what the research is showing in this case. And again, you can see some of that research in the National Academy of Sciences session that of March this year.
Uri, I found this question humorously honest. Is there a way to do this just part way with the innovations? Particularly if there are a few colleagues who actively oppose change?
Yeah. I really love that question because a lot of my time I spend doing department reviews. I sit on a lot of external review committees for math departments, and I have a lot of ex-students and colleagues working on these files. We have to be realistic. Departments differ. We have to, first of all, respect our colleagues. We have to figure out a way. It's not like we have perfect answers here and that we are so positive of what we're doing. We need, some departments, people can have differences and constructively move forward. Some of our departments are dysfunctional and they don't have the ability to sit down and have any discussion. For those of you who care about students and moving them forward, sometimes we have to build a support group and work and do what we can. Sometimes, if we're lucky, we're in departments that can actually make collective decisions and move forward on them. So that's a real question. You gotta keep pushing for the mission. The thing that needs to drive our actions is the mission of our institutions. It can't be the prejudices or conceits of a few faculty members. This is too important for our country and too important for the lives of our students. But in reality, providing abstract guidance on how to move a department forward, that which should win a Fields Medal, if anyone can figure that out. Let me just put another. People always assume that I'm a super optimist. My family, the most common expression my mother used in her life was, "Son, you can never worry enough." This work is very hard, right? It's very hard to ask fundamental questions about who we're really serving well. And because once you answer those questions, they have moral consequences. But we have to stand up for the right thing. We have to stand up for our students. That's what makes a profession. And we have to develop the political skills to move our department in ways that reflect our mission, our institutional mission. And no one should think that's easy.
So one question is the general takeaway here, are you recommending that we essentially throw out of high school GPA?
You broke up there. Could you just restate the question?
Are you recommending we essentially throw out placement tests in favor of GPA?
I'm not ready to go that far. I think what we need to do, it depends where we are, what's already in place. I think we need to build institutional placement systems. And I think there are a lot of reasons that we should build high school GPA and courses into those systems. And there's research evidence that they should be the first layer. Why? Because the gap between high school and college needs to get closer. If we ignore high school, it's sending bad policy messages. But I'm for providing the best tools to help people make informed decisions. And I think there is room for tools to help students choose which course they're going to be in. But I also think that those processes are going to require some face-to-face time. You know, these instruments usually can tell you who has no chance and who you don't have to worry about at the ends. The problem is they're really crappy in the middle. So the real answer is I think we need system instruments that have positive policy externalities, to use the jargon. But I also think we need to think about how we help our students make informed choices. And probably it's not cheap. It's going to require that we actually sit down with our students, look them in the eye, listen to them, take a look at what they think math is and their experiences. I don't frankly see a system that's going to depend on a $6 test.
I have an interesting question here. Is there research comparing non-course-based options with developmental courses co-requisite with credit level courses? I mean, maybe there's research comparing both to traditional, but is there research comparing those two?
Yeah, it may be an element of the RAND Corporation study of co-requisites in Texas. So that study, RAND does high quality work. I actually have some questions about this last study they did. I would give it a B+ in my advanced course, but they're generally pretty good. And I think that's included because Texas has legislation, has policy that allows the use of so-called non-course-based options. Probably a difficulty will be that means different things in different places. So it's not going to be easy to do those studies. But I would start by looking at the recently published RAND study in Texas. We can add that to our list of references.
And perhaps
if that person is in Texas, if they email me, I can connect them to the person in the higher ed coordinating board who was interested in that exact question.
Perhaps this is a good last question to focus on, and you can sew this up with maybe a final call to action, as it were. Does the co-requisite approach ultimately reduce the achievement gap?
I hope so. I'm seeing it in many cases. It certainly does in the Georgia data, in the earlier Tennessee data, in the Texas data. But I think we have an opportunity here. The challenge is that in many cases, prerequisites are spreading so quickly that on certain campuses, people are just doing remedial tutoring. That's much less effective than the co-requisites that fit into the kind that AMATIC and MAA are recommending. Right, we are actually noticing students work where you're using active pedagogies. So in co-requisites that work, there are features. For example, it's important for many students to know the names of the courses that come next. Many of our students of color, and many poor white students, the rural white students, my future farmers of America and my 4-Hers, don't even know the names of the courses they're going to take in the sophomore year. Co-requisites have to be designed to give students support they need to excel in the content and an image of what comes next. So the Dana Center, together with many of our partners, has been putting together a co-requisite design collaborative, really to go hand in hand with AMATIC and MAA, with the curriculum groups interested in this. It's a new area. We have a chance to make it more effective and equity friendly. And I just want to say at the end that the professional societies, both AMATIC and MAA, are working on their policy recommendations. The recommendations about placement are about 10 years old. And Frank, my colleague Frank Savina, is working on this, and Crafty is working on it.
Thank you, Uri. I appreciate that. Yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Frank Savina. I'm a former math instructor at El Paso Community College, and now I get to work with Uri at the Dana Center, where I work on curriculum and professional learning at the higher ed level. Yes, I'm part of the Crafty Committee, which is the Curriculum Renewal Across the First 2 Years Committee, which is actually a subcommittee of the CUPM committee for for MAA. That's the committee on the undergraduate program in math. And I just wanted to let everybody know that we're actually working on a discussion paper to hopefully provide guidance from MAA around the idea of co-requisites. And I just wanted to let you know that a lot of the questions that have been raised here and the questions that were actually submitted earlier, I'm going to take these back as part of our kind of information gathering phase before we start to author any papers or any recommendations. So I've found out a lot today about where our field is. I learned a lot from Uri as well, as much as probably everybody here. Thank you, Uri. So we are working on this as part of MAA. Thank you for that, Uri.
And just my last comment is that almost everywhere I go, people are rolling up their sleeves and working their hearts out to make their programs better. People have this vision of us that's not in any way connected to who we are. Lots of people are working to make better placement tools, to make co-requisites in these new structures work. We're at this strange place where there are a lot of new ideas, there's lots of disruption. This is a time to roll up our sleeves, to improve our programs, but not to forget about the kind of skepticism that makes us scholars and academics. The work is not going to be particularly easy. Compensating for disadvantage, for injustice, is not something you do in a weekend. Right? But there is an opportunity here to rebuild our programs in ways that make them more open and to make them fairer, so the beneficiaries are a broader group of people that have benefited from our work in the past. And placement and co-requisites and multiple pathways provide opportunities to do that we should all take advantage of. Been a privilege to do this. I hope this has been helpful to you. And let's get a good set of questions and a good set of things that we should all be looking at as a result of this. Thank you.
So thank you, Uri, and if everyone could, by way of the chat, give him a round of applause or appreciation for his time and his information today. So thank you for participating in the joint webinar. There will be more joint webinars between the two organizations in the future. For those who are not members of AMATIC, we have the link here if you wish to join. We are on Facebook. We have our 2019 conference in Milwaukee coming up in November. We're also in need of a professional development coordinator. So if any AMATIC members out there are interested in this, you can either ask me or check on our website for information about that position. We did record this, and we will update upload the recording within a week or so. So you can share it with colleagues or rewatch it. And then for the evaluation, we have a link or a QR code to go and do the survey. The survey does include a question where you can request a certificate if you need a certificate of attendance for today. So once again, thank you, Uri, for your thoughts. Thank you, Keith, for your collaboration here. And for everyone else, thank you for your participation. I hope you got some good information, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, all. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to enjoy pondering this. And I've got a lot of reading to do, Uri.
You're not alone, my friend.
Well, Pat, there are still 31 people there, so I think they're wondering if there's going to be an Easter egg at the end of this, because it's sort of like a Marvel movie.
That's right. They're waiting for the.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we don't have any
It
credits.
turns out, folks, there's a really, really simple way to do all of this, all of that mumbo jumbo. If you just buy our package for only $39.95, all your problems will be solved.
We should have had a closing like orchestral symphony, and then at the end, Uri comes back with the magic words.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I'll leave, for those here, I'll leave the QR code up for another moment if you're trying to get it or to get the link. And have Uri and Jeremy left the?
They have left the virtual building.
Okay, I did get a Q&A question outside of the chat, which I will send to Uri. It was about his co-requisite calculus. So I got the contact from the person who left the message. So
yes, April.
Survey is closed. Uh-oh, that's not good.
Well, Pat, let me just say personally, I appreciate you doing all of the technology behind the scenes. The mark of success of the technology guy is when nobody appreciates it because it just works. So.
Well, just as you say that, there's chats. Apparently, I had the link wrong for the survey.
Oh,
yeah, the date. If anyone is still there, the date should be at the end 0906.
0906.
I don't. We didn't have a. I have the. I think the QR code is correct, but I have the wrong link. I will send that out. I'll update it and send it out. Let me see. Yeah, the QR code is correct. If anyone's still listening, but the link is wrong. So I will go take care of that right now, and I will stop recording. I just realized I'm still recording.